Hi there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mr. Schwank. Welcome to Cleo's Corner, U.S. History. Today we're taking a look at one of the United States' most difficult presidents to analyze and assess, Andrew Jackson. Throughout American history, we can break down the complex events and personalities of our history into chunks that we would call eras. To this point, we've studied the Age of Discovery, the colonial era, the Revolutionary War era, the Jeffersonian era, and the era of good feelings rather. And now we are turning our attention to the Jacksonian era. The fact that the Jacksonian era follows the era of good feelings alone should probably tell you that America is no longer feeling so good. Or Jackson would just be another part of the era of good feelings. So buckle up, this is going to be a bumpy ride. Jackson was an incredibly polarizing figure even in his time. Americans either loved him or hated him, depending on who you were talking to. He drew a final, decisive end to the era of good feelings as U.S. citizens grew ever more partisan. Jackson ushered in a period of expanded democracy, which made him a hero to average, ordinary Americans. However, he attacked and vilified people who were not loyal to him personally and turned the running of the government on its head, deeply harming its ability to govern and handle crises, which in turn led to a devastating depression, which kicked off the next great American era, westward expansion. What we want to know on today's episode is, did Jackson help or harm American democracy? So, just to get us started today, it's important to give a little background on Jackson himself. This is important because his personal history is an influential factor about how he sees the world and how he interacts with it. Jackson was born in 1767, before the American Revolution. His father was killed accidentally before Jackson was actually born, so his life started under somewhat unusual circumstances, being that it was just him, his mom, and his two older brothers. He was too young to fight in the Revolutionary War, but his eldest brother was, and he died of heat exhaustion after a battle. The following year, Andrew and his other brother joined the war as couriers or message boys, but they were captured by the British. Andrew was assigned to a British officer as a groom or a personal servant. When he refused to polish the officer's shoes, the man actually slashed at Jackson with his sword, leaving Jackson with scars on his head and his hands. While he was captured, both he and his brother contracted smallpox and became very ill. They were released to go back to home to their mother, and while Jackson survived, his brother did not. So now it's down to just his mother and him. It was also a common practice at the time for the British to keep American prisoners of war aboard prison ships. But as many prisoners were wounded or sick and stuck in close quarters, sickness was rampant and many died. Jackson's mother volunteered to care for the prisoners of war on board one of these ships, but she contracted cholera from volunteering and died, leaving Jackson an orphan without any siblings at the age of 14. The events of the war and the loss of his entire family left him with an intense hatred of the British for the rest of his life. After the war, he took on several apprentice jobs, eventually becoming a lawyer. While being a lawyer was a good career, the most powerful people in Southern society were the plantation owners. An entry into that very tight knit group was virtually impossible. So, to sidestep that problem, Jackson moved west to Tennessee, where there was more potential to move into that upper class. He built his own plantation called the Hermitage. Today it's just on the east side of Nashville, Tennessee. and quickly became one of the most powerful people in Tennessee. His fame was not limited to just his social status. He met and married a woman by the name of Rachel Donaldson. Rachel was from an influential Tennessee, Nashville family, but she had been previously married and had left her husband over his abusive behavior. She and Andrew both believed that her divorce had been finalized when they were married. However, Rachel's previous husband had never signed the paperwork. Honestly, it was a minor clerical issue that probably would not happen in today's world of e uh, email and computer technology, but it became a major embarrassment for the couple, given their social standing. When Jackson was in a disagreement over a horse race with a man by the name of Charles Dickinson, not the British writer, Dickinson insulted Rachel over technically being married to two men at the same time. Jackson challenged Dickinson to a duel. Jackson allowed Dickinson to fire at him first. Jackson was hit by Dickinson with the bullet so close to the heart that the bullet could not be removed, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life. Jackson, however, plugged the wound with his finger and shot back. Reportedly, Jackson's shot misfired, which should have ended the duel. However, in a breach of dueling etiquette, Jackson recocked the gun and fired and killed Dickinson. Dueling, especially in the South, was considered at that time a time honored tradition to resolve disputes among gentlemen. So Jackson was never prosecuted for Dickinson's death. We had talked about how Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr had engaged in a similar duel, and nothing really came of that death either. However, the way that Dickinson died, the second shot, was quite a scandal and a deep stain on Jackson's honor, and he suffered socially for it. However, Jackson would rebound. He gained nationwide fame during the War of 1812 as the general who successfully defended New Orleans from the British. His reputation for toughness and his high expectations for his men earned him the nickname Old Hickory. He was also seen as a prolific Indian fighter. His relations with Indians were never good. Not only had they allied themselves with the British, but he saw Native Americans as standing in the way of the development of the United States in the South. We'll come back to natives here in a bit. Suffice to say, for now, that Jackson spent much of his military career fighting natives, especially the Creek and the Seminole in Florida. Circling back to our central question, you can divide the effects of Jackson's actions and time in office into sort of a series of winners and losers for Americans. So that's how we're going to sort of look at this as we go through this video. Squarely in the loser column has to be placed sort of old style U.S. politics. As his national image grew, he decided to run for election in 1824. Keep in mind that this is still the era of good feelings, and all of the candidates in the 24 election were Democratic Republicans. So there were four candidates for president: Jackson, John Quincy Adams, who was the son of the second president, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and a man by the name of William Crawford. While Jackson won the popular vote, the Electoral College vote could not produce a clear winner. By law, that means the election goes to the House of Representatives, and Jackson, Adams, and Crawford were the top candidates. Surprisingly, the House chose Adams to be president. Jackson was outraged and pointed to the event as proof that powerful elites controlled America, and he calls it the corrupt bargain. This It was suspicious that all of Henry Clay's votes decided to vote for Adams, and Clay was then chosen to become Adams's Secretary of State. Jackson and many others used this as an opportunity to spread the notion that America was controlled by a small group of elite people and that average Americans were unable to win influential government positions. Jackson's argument was largely rhetorical. Up to this point in U.S. history, every president had been a founding father. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they were all certainly part of an elite group of Americans. Although Jackson and now John Quincy Adams, who was the son of a president, um, although Jackson was not born into a powerful family, there was nothing about him that was average. He was not the common man. He was a lawyer, a military hero, a powerful Western slave owning plantation owner. Nonetheless, his supporters immediately start campaigning to get him elected in 1828. Jackson is going to spend the next 4 years developing his image as a common guy and earning the support of common, average, everyday Americans. Certainly, the ability for the common man to achieve office was improved under Jackson, but maybe for the wrong reason. In the 1824 election, all four candidates ran as Democratic Republicans. But now you have a party that has split, and you have National Republicans and the Democratic Party. The era of good feelings was decisively over. The Republicans ran Adams, the Democrats nominated Jackson. Jackson was the most popular in the West, and now more Americans lived there and they voted. The election was still intensely personal. Rachel specifically was singled out and targeted over her previous marriage again. The stress of it made her become ill, and she passed away after her husband won the election. Jackson, who was never one to forgive and forget, blamed wealthy elites for her death and harbored a deep hatred for any form of elitism, until the end of his life. Jackson wound up winning the election with ease. He won 70% of the vote. Like his father, Adams, was not a popular president. He was running against Jackson, who was considered by many to be a war hero. And, many of Jackson's supporters voted for him in the hopes that he would enact policies that would keep the government from interfering in their lives. It is interesting, however, to see how the two new parties broke down. If you compare these two maps in 1808, this is before the Federalist meltdown. And so you can see the traditional Federalist areas here in New England, right? New England was always kind of the Federalist backbone. You had the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812. And the rest of the South and uh, West was sort of Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, right? And of course, Madison was Jefferson's protege, right? After the War of 1812, that completely ends and everything. If this was the 1812 election, if this was the 1816, if this was the 1820 election, this entire map would be all one color because there was only one party, the Democratic Republicans. By 1828, however, that is broken down. You now have the Democrats and the National Republicans. And look at the John Adams, John Quincy's dad. John Adams was a Federalist, and sure enough, the National Republicans kind of sort of hit that New England geographical area, and so it's not hard to sort of see that the National Republicans were really kind of just the rebirth of the Federalist Party, right? So Jackson wins in 1828 and wastes no time in carving a name for himself as president. Almost immediately, the people Jackson chose as his cabinet began arguing and fighting with each other. Cabinet secretaries' wives refused to socialize with one of the secretary's wives, claiming that she had been a woman of loose morals. This touches off a scandal called the Petticoat Affair, which was an enormous distraction from the business of government. And it forced Jackson to spend most of his time handling interpersonal arguments between cabinet members. Eventually, this led to a firing of all the cabinet members except for one. While the cabinet members were replaced, cabinet members run executive departments. They are confirmed by the Senate. They advise the president. They are part of the government. You can't not have a cabinet. However, after this first destructive cabinet, Jackson started relying not on the advice of his advisors, but instead on close personal friends. These close personal friend advisors held no formal role in the government. They were not approved by the Senate, and they were called by newspapers Jackson's kitchen cabinet. This is a reference to the idea that sometimes, that a home's kitchen at that moment in history was typically a private part of the house. It was messy and real work took place there, but it wasn't a part of the house that you showed off. The actual approved cabinet, the cabinet that Jackson didn't pay attention to, was called the parlor cabinet, after the room in your house where you entertained guests and you put on the best version of yourself. The reference was meant as an insult to a president who came into office complaining about corruption and backroom deals, but he now only takes advice from unelected, unappointed, unofficial advisors who had physically contributed to his campaign. To that point, also, Jackson instituted what was called patronage, or the spoils system. Basically, he placed the people who contributed the most support or money to his election into places of power. Quote, "To the winner go the spoils," was a quote by New York Senator William Marcy, referring to the fact that the winner of a competition, a war, or in this case, an election, gets to take the goods or benefits from the loser. In the past, if an invading army took your city, they would often enslave your people, ransack your palace, and carry off all of your wealth. Like it or not, as the winner of the war, that was your right and the punishment for resisting. What the senator was saying was that now that Jackson had won, no one is really strong enough to prevent him from abusing his authority. Up to this point in American history, government leaders were often given positions based on their connection to powerful established families, but they had also been raised from childhood to have these positions. They had the education and the experience to run parts of the government and had served in the government for many years. Immediately after Jackson's inauguration, however, a mob of Jackson supporters who had been promised government positions in exchange for support had shown up at the White House demanding their new cushy government jobs, even damaging the mansion itself in the rush to claim their reward. It was a ridiculous embarrassment to the new administration. However, Jackson did fire many of the older career officials and replace them with these new folks who had little in the way of knowledge or experience in running the government. To make matters worse, he would oftentimes move people from job to job to job so that you could, never get comfortable and corrupt in that particular place. But what it also meant was is that you never had time to actually learn your job. And so when people came to the government asking for permission to build something or to receive permits for one thing or another, the person who they were talking to didn't understand how the government would work. And so instead, you would simply slip that person a little bribe and they would make sure that you get the right stamp on your permit to go build your house or whatever. There's there was potentially some corruption before Jackson, but it's not very well documented. There certainly was no evidence of a corrupt bargain in the 1824 election, as Jackson's supporters claimed. Jackson was correct that achieving high political office is easier for those with money and influence, but that's an effect of social class and not crony politics. Jackson instead tears down a system of government and institutes, replaces it with one of the single most corrupt eras in American history. The entire patronage system is based on your loyalty not to the nation or government service, but to the political candidate who wins the election. It becomes a defining characteristic of the Jacksonian era. On a different note, Jackson added another chapter to another important moment in American history. In our previous episode on the era of good feelings, we had mentioned that the American system was instituted by Henry Clay to stimulate the economy, and that had included tariffs on goods coming to and from Europe, or actually from Europe. This protects northern manufacturers, but southern cotton producers were unhappy because it lowered their profits. In an almost comical situation, Southern congressmen hatch a scheme to end these tariffs by creating a bill that actually creates higher tariffs, which would kind of tempt Northern senators to agree. But they also added these really high import taxes, which would then hurt the North. The idea being was the North would see the higher import taxes, it would reject the bill, which would then also kill the tariffs. And the South could then blame the North for killing tariffs. Instead, the plan backfired. The North accepted the bill, and the South was left with these really high tariffs and a really embarrassing situation because they're the ones that caused it. Adams signed the new bill into law. When Jackson took over the presidency, he's certainly no fan of what the South was now calling the tariff of abominations. However, he was a strong supporter of government power now that he was the government power. The South was toying with the idea that states had the right to nullify or declare void bills and laws that Congress passed if the state didn't like it. This is a problem that's been around since the beginning of our history. It is an interesting fundamental question about our democracy. If the nation was created by states uniting, could those states now overrule the nation that they had started? It was a question really of the rights of states versus the rights of the federal government. Jackson was not going to have any of that, though. When South Carolina threatened to pass a state law nullifying the Tariff of Abomination, Jackson pushed through a bill of his own called the Force Bill, which would authorize the government to send troops into North Carolina to enforce federal power if South Carolina tried to nullify the tariffs. Now, South Carolina wound up backing down, but a very important precedent had been established. One of the reoccurring themes so far in American history has been the relationship and power difference between the states and the government. And the nullification crisis emphatically lays down the law again that the federal government was supreme and the states were not. The lesson that South Carolina and the rest of the southern states learned that day is that times were changing. Slavery would be the next big conflict. And if push comes to shove between the federal government trying to end slavery and state governments trying to keep slavery, that the only way the South would win is if they were willing to break away from the Union. Certainly, the sort of the unique my way or the highway personality of Jackson, being the one to handle the nullification crisis, certainly made the situation more antagonistic, but that would only drive the point home that much more. A bully in the White House is going to trample over your state rights. And we wound up taking another step towards civil war. Now, Jackson's fight with elites take a lot of different forms throughout his life. When he was younger, the British were the powerful elites that he fought in the Revolutionary War against the provincial Americans. Not being able to crack into the planter class in the East led him to establish himself in Nashville, where he became an elite himself. He framed his entire political career as a fight against elites in the government. However, his fight didn't stop there. He's absolutely now in the elite class of American citizens, but he's not going to stop. Um, the saying "money is power" rang true in Jackson's ears, and the one place he could not appoint supporters to was also one of his biggest targets, the National Bank. Now, obviously, the National Bank had been a hot topic since its creation, um, and it had many powerful opponents. Jefferson hated the First National Bank. Madison had allowed the First National Bank charter to expire, but it had proven its usefulness, and Congress instituted a second national bank. Now, before we really get into this, it's important to understand how the national bank worked. It's not a traditional deposit bank like your family may have, your savings account in or your checking account in. Those types of banks, deposit banks, are created by private companies and they are regulated by states. The national bank is essentially the treasury of the United States. Leaders of the national bank are responsible for paying debts to other nations, lending money to state banks, and regulating the flow of money. So let me give you an example. If I were a private bank owner, I want to create the first bank of Schwenk. I would apply for a federal loan. I would prove that I was legit, and the federal bank, or the national bank, would give me, let's say, $25 million. Okay. Now, I'm going to have to repay that loan at, say, an interest rate of 1%. Okay. I'm just throwing numbers out there. I don't have the slightest clue if that's actually, how much they pay back. But the way I make money is by taking that $25 million and loaning it to other people. And I'm going to charge them 8% interest so that they pay me back more than what I have to pay the federal government back. However, that's how I make profit. Now, if I know that I'm lending money out that I have to pay back myself, you better bet your boopy that I'm only going to lend this money to people that I know will pay me back. Jackson saw this process as inherently elitist. The Bank of the U.S. would only provide those loans to people it deems worthy, in particular, people who were already established financially. If you were a poor country common farmer, you're too risky. The chance that you're not going to pay me back is too much. I have to pay this money back to the federal government. So whether or not this means that the bank was only giving money to its elite friends, or if it means that it was making responsible decisions with the public's tax dollars, I guess that's a matter of interpretation. The biggest issue is that Jackson did not trust the bank, and he publicly feuded with its president, Nicholas Biddle. The required the National Bank requires permission or a charter from the Congress in order to operate. And so when Biddle tried to recharter, Jackson vetoes the recharter, and the bank lost its permission to exist. This is a crisis situation. Where does the government put its money? Jackson decided that the best way to keep the money flowing is now to put simply the money that was in the national bank to just put it directly into state banks, right? Now, to make matters worse, Jackson selects rich banks that get the money based on how close they supported him. So he gives the money to his bank friends. These banks are labeled pet banks by opponents, and they were another form of patronage system, but they were just simply outright corrupt. I mean, it was corruption in its most pure form, right? So, what is the effect of this? Now the banks are more willing to loan money to average, ordinary people. While this seems like a good thing, it's actually really bad. If the federal government now gives my bank $25 million and I don't have to pay it back to anybody, why not take a bigger risk? I don't have to pay the money back. And so I start sending money out. I start sending more loans out to riskier people. This causes, people to default on their loans. They don't pay the money back. And as banks start to loan more money than what we actually have in the bank, people are unable to repay their loans, banks go bankrupt. This causes a new economic depression. So if you're a farmer with nothing to your name, you took out a loan, the money was wasted, and now the bank has come to take your home and farm because you can't repay your loan. All you simply do is pack the family up in the wagon and head west out to land where they don't know who you are, and you can sort of restart again. And this literally begins the westward expansion era. And we'll talk about it next week, right? The Oregon Trail and settling California and Oregon and pioneers heading out west. So the one last thing I said that I would come back to it is that we cannot get a full picture of Andrew Jackson without discussing his relationship with Native Americans. This is a relationship that has played out over Jackson's entire life, starting with the Creek War. However, we've not discussed it much because it's easier to talk about as its own independent topic. The big idea here is that Jackson's Indian removal policy sets the standard for future relations with Native groups as America expands. So the way that Jackson handles Native Americans becomes the model of how we deal with Native Americans when in our next era as we start moving out into the Great Plains, and it's our interactions with groups like the Sioux and the Comanche and the Apache and um, uh, all of these Great Plains Indian tribes, and just it's not a very good way of dealing with the situation. Um, the hallmark episode in Jackson's presidency relating to natives has to be the Trail of Tears, a forced march of Indian tribes in the deep South, away from their homes to new lands west of the Mississippi, specifically what we call today Oklahoma. Many of the natives died of sickness, freezing to death, and disease during the march. Many of the times, soldiers would come into a village, kick down the doors, say, "Gather up whatever you have, you're leaving right now." And so, as they are marching, even through the South, through the winter time with no shelter, no food, it's a devastating event. While Jackson removes most of the Indians east of the Mississippi from the north and the south, there were the Sauk and the Fox and the Potawatomi in the north that were also moved out. The majority of these are in the south, and they're what we call the five civilized nations: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Um, these southern natives had adopted European ways of life and in an attempt to avoid removal. However, their crime was not that they maintained their traditional ways. Their crime was being Native American themselves. No amount of cultural assimilation could have prevented white Americans from kicking natives off their land. So the event starts with the passage of what's called the Indian Removal Act, which gives Jackson the power to remove all natives out of land east of the Mississippi. The Americans start with the Choctaw, who were the closest tribe to the border, and between 1831 to 1833, the entire population was forced to march into the newly established Indian Territory, which is, like I said, present day Oklahoma. By this point, the Cherokee had sued the U.S. government, claiming that through various treaties, what the U.S. was doing was illegal. Believe it or not, the Supreme Court sides with the natives. They declare Indian removal illegal. Jackson, but instead, Jackson ignores the court order and continues to remove the tribes. Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The meaning being that the words don't really mean much, and Marshall has no way to stop Jackson from doing pretty much whatever he wants. A court can order it, but can't enforce the order. So Jackson next targets the Chickasaw, who oddly were the only tribe to see kind of what was going to be the end result. And they agreed to move willingly if the U.S. government paid them for their land. This allowed the Chickasaw to have time and money to prepare for the removal and also to establish themselves in the Indian Territory with resources at their disposal. You know, the civilized nations, the five civilized nations, they adopt these European ways of life. They dress like Americans. They convert to Christianity. They abandon their log homes and create sort of brick European style homes. The Cherokee actually invent a writing system of their own and create a constitution. But the Chickasaw, interestingly, actually adopt a different form of European culture. They are slave owning. they actually ally with the South later on in the Civil War and send members of their tribe to fight alongside the Confederates. Um, so that's just kind of an interesting side note. Jackson's old nemesis, the Creek, were the next to go. Jackson had allied with half of the Creek against the other half of the tribe during the Creek War. When we've already talked about the Creek War and how Jackson fought the Creek War, but in fact, really, the Creek War was a civil war between the Creek Indians. Jackson allied with half of them against the other half. And in simply an amazing betrayal, now that half of the Creek were gone, he goes after his unsuspecting allies, taking all of their land. The other major tribe that Jackson fights are the Seminole in Florida. Many of the Seminole were ethnically other tribes who had fled south, or they were even escaped slaves that we call the Black Seminole. Um, Regardless, they know the United States and they know what to expect from them. They don't just simply sort of roll over and die. They fight a series of wars. The first Seminole War resulted in the treaty that gives Florida to the U.S. But when Jackson comes to remove them, they fight a second Seminole War, and they fight this extended guerrilla style of war um, that uh, very nearly defeats the United States. However, in the end, they are overwhelmed, and most of them are also removed to the Indian Territory. There were some, a little bit that stayed in Florida near Lake Okeechobee, and today there are still some sizable Seminole reservations in Florida still. Last but not least are the Cherokee, and they sort of are a story in and of themselves. They were the largest and the best organized of all of these tribes, and they were also the group that had most completely assimilated into American ways of life. However, um, Jackson dealt with them by finding reach in a very small group of Cherokee, reaching an agreement with this small group of Cherokee, saying that all the Cherokee would be willing to, um, uh, you know, be part of the treaty when this very small group did not speak for everyone else. And so with that treaty, armed with that treaty, the US Army goes in and says, "Nope, sorry, some of your chiefs signed it. That means you all have to go." Um, it's actually this piece of the forced migration, the Cherokee portion, that is specifically what we refer to when we talk about the Trail of Tears. But in the end, nearly 100,000 Native Americans are going to be forced from their homes. Roughly 13 to 17,000% of them die. Or excuse me, not 13 to 17,000%, but 13 to 17,000 people die on this, about 1,000-mile journey that they have to walk. So, kind of just to sum this up, clearly Jackson remains a controversial figure even today. He did undoubtedly make the United States more democratic, if by democratic you mean that he involved a greater number of people in the functioning of the government. His policies may have given a greater voice to rural, poor, common people, but at the cost of a stable financial system, rampant corruption in politics, and ineffective government. Additionally, while more land was opened up to white farmers, it was opened up only after the forced removal of the previous native residents. So the debate over the role of Jackson's impact on democracy and the era of American history that bears his name will continue to be a divisive topic well into the future. Thanks for joining me this week. I'll see you on our next episode.